Hello and welcome to the Navigating Risks podcast. My name's Helen Yates and I'm editor of Global Thought Leadership at Gallagher. I'm joined today by Matthew Currie, Regional Claims Leader in the Midlands for Gallagher, and Polly Sayers, a solicitor at HCR Law in its Insurance, Risk and Regulatory team. I began by asking them what PFAS, also known as forever chemicals, are, and why we should be concerned about them.
I think the better question is, what are they not? They're ubiquitous. They're a group of around 1,000 chemicals that have been used since the 1950s in all sorts of industries. So manufacturing, water, grease and stain resistance products. So the original non-stick pans or Teflon, that's a form of PFAS. And the reason they're called forever chemicals and why there's so much kind of discussion about them and their consequences is that they don't break down naturally in the environment. So when they're left into the environment, they linger on in the soil and they cause a buildup of toxins. And that then, if it's consumed by the human body, can have potentially adverse health effects. Matt, is there anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is, as you say, that it's the unknown, isn't it? And we still don't know out of the 4,000, or here's some reports of 10,000 chemicals as to which ones are the most toxic. There's some reports out there that say, they can degrade in 10 years. Other reports are saying they can take 1,000 years to degrade. They're highly mobile. Obviously they can, move easily through air, water, land, and then, as you say, accumulate then in soil, plants, and animals. And there's obviously good evidence to say it's a significant risk to humans, and that's the concern. But I mean, I wanted to touch on it because obviously there's a tendency to give them a bad press, and obviously there's so much out there that is negative. But we must not forget that these have been around for 100 years, and they're really good at resisting water, heat, and oil. And Teflon obviously is a good example, but also PPE equipment. Obviously they provide a vital role in PPE equipment and have saved many lives. So I do think we have to remind ourselves of that as well.
A really important aspect is their use in firefighting services, and that's why they're so powerful and they've been used by so many industries for so long, is just their ability to be resistant to external factors like fire and high amounts of air and water and pressure. And that is why they've been adopted by the particularly emergency services personnel to use in those situations that are life or death, extremely dangerous, because they do offer that degree of protection that other PPE equipment without such chemical coating wouldn't. And that's also why it's been used in military services for so long. I think to add to what you're saying, Matt, it's important to recognise that there is evidence that's growing around the potentially adverse human health consequences. However, to distinguish from something that we know of like asbestos, there isn't yet a signature disease that's linked to it. There's possible links to a range of adverse health outcomes, like types of cancers, some thyroid diseases and fertility issues, but that causation from a science perspective isn't yet completely concrete and completely established. So we need to be careful when we're discussing the human effects that we're not jumping to conclusions. There's still quite a lot of scientific ambiguity around it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know we'll get onto it, but that's obviously the concern of, in our world, in insurance world, underwriters don't like unknowns and uncertainty, and asbestos, where you could sort of ring fence it to respiratory related diseases. This one's sort of open-ended. There's lots of, reports, as you say, that it can have, multiple health effects. So yeah, that's the concern.
I mean, it sounds like the key issue here, beyond the fact that more research needs to be done, is the fact that they don't break down easily and can get into waterways and the soil and into animals as well. That seems to be a key issue here.
Yeah, absolutely. So even after, for example, with obviously on waterproof clothing, even after washing your waterproof clothing, they're still present, and that can then penetrate the skin barrier, get into the blood. That is a real concern. To touch on the scale of it, I mean, it's detected in 96% of surface water in the UK. And the remediation costs alone, the hundreds of billions, estimated, and that's just on what we know.
It's interesting what you said about the degree of exposure, because we've had the UK release its first PFAS plan, which was only released earlier this year in February. And that's given us a slightly more accurate understanding of just the degree of exposure and contamination. As you say, 96% of surface water samples and also around 50% of groundwater samples. And they've also found it in the bodies of a lot of animal species that live in the water systems in the UK. And they're also doing further research into how human exposure can occur, including not just skin contact with PFAS products, but also through drinking water, through indoor dust. It's difficult to contain to just not using PFAS products on your body. There's multiple routes now of contamination, and it seems like the government is really prioritising research in trying to identify those key exposure risks for the UK general public.
Given the prevalence of these chemicals in that case, and just thinking about it from a business liability point of view, I mean, it must be very challenging to understand where the contamination may have arisen from, but also then to remediate that.
Yeah, that's part of the problem, and that's our concern as brokers. When advising our clients, certainly there's going to be more industries that are going to be more exposed to this than others, particularly, as Holly touched on earlier, the aviation, automotive, construction industries. That we've got a lot of construction clients. I'm part of the construction group, and that's a concern. It's in a lot of construction materials, so there is some mitigation factors, and tracing their supply chain is a big element of that. Finding out obviously where their materials are coming from, whether they contain PFAS, and how they can control that. But there is going to be a movement to PFAS-free sort of economy. I read one report where a PFAS-free economy by sort of 2040 is going to reach sort of 14.9 billion. So there is obviously that awareness and a demand to move towards PFAS-free materials, but at the same time, we have to remind ourselves of the safety. And when you think about insurance and property risks, particularly, again, as Polly touched on, military and airport bases, where, if it's a Class B or liquid fire, it's only the PFAS foam that will help fight that, protect lives. The greener alternatives that are out there just won't do the job. And that is obviously a risk to life, isn't it? So we have to be careful as to what we transition to that's PFAS free, I think, to make sure it's still safe.
It strikes me as well that when you talk about large environmental liability claims, everyone has heard a story of how, there's been a fire, say, at a facility, and the company has then been held liable for the impact of the firefighting foams that have been used to put out the fire and the impact that has had on the surrounding area. So it sounds like this is something that maybe all industry sectors should be thinking about.
Absolutely, yeah. We had a claim for a client ourselves just in that very instance where they were using the old firefighting foam that had just recently been banned, but it escaped into the watercourse and down to a local fishing lake. And it wasn't the PFAS itself, because the PFAS itself wouldn't kill the fish instantly, but it robbed them of oxygen because it was a surface layer of on the top. That's what killed them. So and there was an investigation by the Environment Agency, and it was a significant cost to the business. But again, they deal with chemicals, and they felt that the movement to alternative greener firefighting foams just wasn't safe enough for them. And likewise, the property insurer was not happy about that either, because obviously it's a risk to them.
Yeah, and we're now seeing this translate into the litigation context. Obviously, there's been discussion for years and years about the US, because that's always the hotspot for class actions and claimant activist actions. However, we did see the first PFAS-related claim be brought in the UK in 2024. That was brought by a claimant firm on behalf of residents of Bentham, which was known in the media as the UK's most polluted town. The reason it was actually brought was directly a consequence of the Jacobs report, which was government-published report around the levels of PFAS exposure in particular areas of the UK. So after seeing that report and the levels, they identified that there was a company called Angus Fire Limited that was manufacturing PFAS-related firefighting foam that contained PFAS. and brought the claim on behalf of those residents. So the idea that these claims are simply a US problem and aren't yet on the shores of the UK is now incorrect. That matter did end up settling for an undisclosed amount, and there was no liability admissions made. But I think while that's the first example we've seen in the UK litigation context, it will be far from the last. So for companies that are operating in the UK, it's not a matter of when, it's a matter of now and how you're going to be proactive in mitigating those real litigation risks that are fully realised now.
And certainly since COVID, when we've had a significant backlog in the courts, and there's been that grouping the claims together in a class action is a lot easier for them to deal with.
Yes, yeah, certainly that's the way that most class actions have been running in the US and even in other jurisdictions like Australia and Canada. However, in the UK, there was definitely more of a judicial reluctance to engage with class actions, or as they're called here, group litigation orders. We are starting to see a shift in the court's attitude and more practical approaches being taken, as you say, because of that backlog that's COVID related. And it's very likely that the types of PFAS claims that we'll see will be class actions brought on behalf of either residents or groups of people that have worked with these chemicals. So firefighters is an obvious example, also factory workers, so groups like that. And the potential kind of the size of the claimant class is massive, as you can imagine, because the level of contamination is unknown, but from what we've seen already seems to be quite prevalent in all areas of the UK. So that's a real risk and something to be looking out for in terms of the litigation space.
If anybody's obviously seen the Dark Waters film and about DuPont on Amazon Prime, obviously it was all about the contamination of the watercourses killing livestock. You know, there was obviously a Toxic Town series about it was not specifically around PFAS, but it's certainly in the public mind now. And obviously we've got that group class action that's going on in the UK around, and then that was nitrogen and phosphorus against Welsh Water and Avara Foods. There's 4,000 claimants, and it's more about this health related impacts, but more about the fact that the rivers are now full of algae instead of fish, and it's destroying the nature and the enjoyment of those rivers down in South Wales. So we're only a step away, I think, from PFAS. A similar class action claim relating to PFAS, I think.
Holly, what are your thoughts on where we're going from a litigation point of view? And when it comes to PFAS, what are the challenges around proving causation, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I think my thoughts on where it's going is like what Matt just predicted. We're probably likely to see class action claims be brought. If the UK jurisdiction follows the US, they tend to go after the manufacturers, the PFAS manufacturers in the first instance, as there's an obvious kind of consequence there, and establishing liability is an easier hurdle. However, we've now seen in the US that the claims are starting to be brought against secondary defendants, which aren't the manufacturers per se, but companies and government bodies that are using products that contain PFAS in their supply chain system or giving them to customers. So there's also that downstream exposure for those second defendant groups. So it's not enough to simply think, oh, well, I don't manufacture it myself, so therefore liability doesn't arise. However, what you say about causation is a real hurdle and one that shouldn't be understated. So for claimant groups, there's two substantive hurdles that remain. The first is establishing when the cause of action accrues, which essentially means establishing the date or the time period for exposure for limitation purposes. So you only have a certain amount of years to bring a claim. You can only bring, let's say in personal injury, you can only bring a claim 3 years after the exposure date or 3 years after the injury. But when you have something like PFAS, which has been gradually in your environment for years and years, trying to pinpoint the exact time period when it became an injury for you as a claimant is incredibly difficult because of how ubiquitous it is, but also how specific you would need your scientific evidence to be. to prove that it should be that date and not 10 years in the future or 20 years before, because it's been around for so long. And if it was certainly before you plead it, then you might come into limitation issues where you've run out of time to bring your claim. So that's the first big causation hurdle. The second is establishing the chain of causation. So linking the injury sustained to PFAS exposure. So as we said before, there's a range of possible illnesses that have been linked to PFAS, but there hasn't been enough scientific inquiry around establishing them as signature diseases yet. There's still a lot of unknowns. If you are the claimant and say, for example, you develop some form of thyroid issue, you have to prove that but for the PFAS exposure, you would not have developed the thyroid issue. And that is very difficult to do when the science is not established firmly. So in terms of how you would go about defending, it would be really putting claimant groups to proof on supplying that medical and scientific evidence. And I think at the moment, that's still a huge hurdle for claimants. So whilst I would say that litigation risk is extremely high and it's very likely we're going to see big group actions be brought against a range of different types of industries and companies, that doesn't mean just because an action is brought, that doesn't mean it's proven. It doesn't mean it's going to be successful. And there's still key evidence-based hurdles that will really be scrutinised by a court if a PFAS claim comes before it.
Is it the case that once you get a legal precedent that it kind of almost opens the floodgates to similar type claims in the future?
It certainly helps, and I think a lot of claimant firms will be looking to see who takes the first step and waiting with bated breath, because just from a commercial perspective, you don't want to run a claim that you don't think has good prospects of success. So certainly if they get a positive decision from the court, it does suggest that the court's willing to acknowledge liability and kind of establish damages. However, this is such a lawyer caveat, each case has to be heard on its own facts. Just because one case succeeds does not mean every case succeeds. And the court is going to be very reluctant to make sweeping statements about liability for PFAS. I can almost guarantee that they will confine their judgment to the specific circumstances of the case that's brought before them. So whilst it will perhaps give a positive indication to claimant lawyers and claimant firms that are looking to see how it plays out, that certainly doesn't mean that every PFAS case that's going to be brought is a box-ticking exercise where it's just going to be straight through and liability is going to be easily established.
Matt, how should clients be thinking about this? Not just in terms of how they limit their own liability, but also how they protect their people, when they're out in the workplace.
It's a good point. Obviously, I think, the first thing is that they don't need to overreact in the first instance, because they're not going to be the only ones, but they do need to, and we've talked about this with certain clients already, early investigation when purchasing and developing the sites is key. Understanding, the prevalence of PFAS and evaluating the costs of obviously treating that, whether it's the soil, water, waste, wherever they're involved with, and also engaging with the regulatory authorities early. So be transparent with the Environment Agency, tell them about what they've discovered. So that's a key thing in the UK government plan, the DEFRA report that came out on the 3rd of February. Is the three pillars of that framework is around identifying the sources, accounting for the movement, around society and environment, and then most importantly, reducing the exposure for humans and animals. And that's if, all our businesses that we look after, if they have that in their mind and do that as best as possible, I think, they can only do what is reasonable. Reasonable is a key word, isn't it? As Polly's aware in the legal side. And as long as they're thinking about that and they're not ignoring it and burying their hands in the sand, and I think at this point, that's as much as they can do. But I mean, going back to causation, just as from our perspective as a broker, thinking about insurers and what they're thinking about, I think that's their saving grace really, is that it is very difficult. It was going to be very difficult for the claimants to establish causation. And also there's going to be multiple companies involved here, isn't there? So it's, when there is any claim, and and that also we know about the polluter pays principle, and that it will hold any manufacturer's industrial users responsible for the costs, whether existing or whether it's historic. But even then, obviously, you can trace it back to other companies. So that will give insurers some comfort. But when we see at the moment some sort of 2023 onwards, when the HSE first did their UK REACH report on PFAS, it was almost a sort of instant knee-jerk reaction, as insurers sometimes do, where we then started to see sort of blanket PFAS exclusions. And it's our job, and HCR law, where Polly works, has helped us in the past, not relating to PFAS, but certainly group class actions for legacy claims, because the tail on some of the claims that we could see could be long. And something that HCR have helped with in the past is not just making sure there's no gaps in their insurance coverage, but also looking at the policy wordings, and particularly the pollution and contamination exclusions.
The tail can be quite long on these kind of claims. So does that mean potentially that losses could fall under historic policies that were underwritten before these kind of exclusions came in?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to touch on, because you were involved as Polly, weren't you, on what we did in relation to the talc litigation?
Certainly, that's the key issue for clients is perhaps you have policies that you've adopted in the previous years since this risk became known that adequately addresses things like PFAS contamination. However, many historic policies don't. So there's still that liability exposure for the insurer if you're going back. And as we know, sometimes with PFAS exposure linked to human health consequences, for example, it can take 10 to 20 years for that illness to become apparent in that person's body, which means that the policy that's applying is not your 2024 or 2025 policy. It's your one from the early 2000s or even the 90s, which is much less likely to have those really developed environmental contamination type exclusions and kind of deal with environmental pollution in a comprehensive way that we now see is adopted as standard practice in the insurance industry. So that's certainly insurers, and we have seen, as Matt said, kind of standardized PFAS exclusions pop up in the market. But it doesn't protect you from the historic exposure that could come out in these claims, depending on when the PFAS was first and contaminated into the environment, particularly in property damage claims. So there was a case in Australia that went to the High Court, which is the Australia's equivalent of the Supreme Court in the UK, but essentially involving a range of property owners that brought a claim for property damage based on historic PFAS exposure from firefighting foam being dropped into their land area that they then purchased homes on, and it degraded the value of the land. And that was brought against the government because the firefighting foam operation was part of the military services. But that was from years and years ago. And liability was established and damages had to be paid in the millions. So certainly we're seeing the market adopt quite a cautionary position now in terms of exclusions. However, that doesn't prevent exposure for the long tail of some of these more historic claims.
So could this be the next asbestos for the insurance industry?
Yeah, it has the potential to be the next asbestos.
I think the way you worded it, Matt, was correct in terms of it is potentially the next asbestos. I don't think we should be jumping to say it definitely is yet because of those causation requirements, particularly around the signature disease element. Asbestos was quite easy to establish the medical link between the exposure and the associated illnesses. We are certainly not there yet from a science perspective and from a medical perspective in making that link obvious. So whilst there's the long tail of potential exposure for the industry, and there's certainly reason to be alert to the potential of these claims being brought, particularly given the range of industries involved, that we're not there yet, and we'll kind of have to wait and see how the first one that doesn't get settled and actually makes its way through the court system, how that's actually dealt with, particularly those causation issues, how the court actually treats them. And that will be a really helpful insight for the industry, for both claimants and defendant lawyers, as well as just the broader insurance industry, to see what those sticking points are, because that's going to be fundamental to how businesses and insurers approach PFAS going forward.
Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to talk about, or any parting thoughts?
So there's the environmental impairment liability that is the main policy that we'd look to respond to pollution and contamination for their own site, but also obviously third-party sites. But I think we are seeing a restriction sort of in the market from EIL insurers, and in order for them to be comfortable, there is quite extensive site assessments, environmental data that is demanded from our clients. So it is quite labour intensive in getting them comfortable with the risk and making sure that that cover remains. But obviously, again, we're obviously keen to support clients with doing that, to make sure they've got that protection beyond 2023. Product liability insurers, likewise, particularly where we're seeing tightening of terms, particularly where package is used in packaging. And obviously that's a significant worry for product liability insurers. But then going back to sort of what clients should be doing, there's also the D&O, directors and officers liability risk. So ESG is obviously high on the agenda in general. So insurers want to be comfortable that they've got good ESG governance, risk oversight, that they're thinking about PFAS, to actually make sure that that there's no risk from a director's point of view. But then likewise, property, capacity is an issue at the minute in terms of property risks. But on the flip side, property insurers are going to be concerned where they can't use the PFAS foam and be able to put out these fires at an early stage. And if the alternatives aren't suitable, then obviously that's going to concern them on the flip side.
As a company, we've done a lot recently around lithium-ion battery fires, and the requirements there are quite different in terms of firefighting. I wonder if that's also something that maybe businesses should be thinking about going forward.
Yeah, and then that's a live, series that's constantly in the news, isn't it? With the lithium-ion batteries, and certainly it's something that they should be, they are thinking about already. And we've worked with clients to try and find a suitable firefighting foams or liquids that can deal with these fires. To some extent with those, obviously you can't use anything, so it's a different method of trying to manage them. But with these chemicals and certain liquid fires at certainly military and aviation bases, then it is the Class B firefighting foam that is going to, or has proven to work. But it's obviously, if it's the knock-on effects of the PFAS that's then going to be the concern, I think.
Holly, any parting thoughts from you?
It's a live issue. It's certainly complex. There's various areas to be concerned about, but it is also an opportunity for the industry to proactively manage emerging environmental risks, which is only going to be something that continues in our modern world. And there's very interesting causation questions that we're still waiting for answers on. So I think watch this space, and lawyers are here to help if you need us.
Great stuff. Thank you both very much. That's all we've got time for today. Thanks for listening.